Hello and welcome to the Doubts-aloud podcast. This is episode 21, part 3 of the Summer of Slavery.
We've been taken over.
Blimey, who are you?
I'm glad you asked.
That wasn't
Good
me
question.
with a changed voice, by the way. That is someone else.
My name is Steve Tomkins. Pleased to meet you.
Yes, well, you were our guest back on episode number 11.
That's true.
We interviewed you, and we also talked about pragmatic arguments on that one.
Yeah, and it's good to have you back as the host.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me.
Well, Steve is back on the show to basically, as we're getting to Summer of Slavery Part 3, which is now moving on in history, and we're going to delve into the abolition movement in the UK as part of today's show. And Steve is none other than an expert on that, and we'll get more into that a bit later.
Yes, because we were chatting about church history when Steve was our guest all those months ago.
We did.
Indeed. So, okay, so we'll come back to you a little bit later, Steve, and sort of bring you in. But Steve is going to be hanging out, as it were, for the rest of this show. And so, Francis, what's the news?
You're asking me what the news is?
Yeah, I am.
I haven't got any news. I've just come back from Turkey.
Okay. Ed, you can.
Yeah, you've got to tell me the news.
Well, Steve actually is a leading light of the Greenbelt Christian Festival, and he hosted one or two of the events, including a pub quiz in the Jesus Arms.
A church history pub quiz.
Oh, right.
Yes, which I did spectacularly badly at.
Oh no. I love quizzes. Are you going to do another one if you do another event?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Oh, coming to the next one then.
I think you passed, Ed. It was just that there was tough competition.
Okay, yes. I was in a team of one.
That's always
didn't help.
That's always hard. A team of one.
And one of the things we were doing at Greenbelt was the three of us from the London discussion group. So that's Steve, Andrew, and myself. We led a couple of late night discussion sessions. So one of them was an idea that Andrew did and we did in the London discussion group quite early on about talking about what the weaknesses is of our position. And then the second one we did was discussing, presenting your worldview, as it were, how you see things, and then having to defend it in a, like 1 Peter 3:16, the famous verse for apologetics, to give a defense. Always be ready to give a defense of the gospel or something like that, with gentleness and respect. So we jumped into that. And the idea is it's a Christian festival. So the typical punter at Greenbelt would be someone who was a sort of eager beaver, evangelically type in their youth and have sort of softened around the edges and become rather more liberal in their later years, and happy to talk about it. Well, that was the kind of person who came into our group, but I think that's a slightly skewed assessment because there are a lot of younger people mixed in.
Yeah, it does seem that some younger people these days are more on the liberal end anyway, almost off the bat in certain ways, but compared with some, but Greenbelt to me is like full of more liberal Christians along the spectrum. Yeah. And what was good about the talk that we did with Steve is the way that we outlined it was just natural, really, that Steve was sort of more on the liberal progressive end of Christianity. I was under the agnostic title, and Ed was quite proud to
I was beyond the pale.
Yeah, and so my agnosticism can really help me at Greenbelt because it can sort of people sort of say, I don't know, people just sort of go, agnostic.
And there were a lot of people there, weren't there, who were really keen to engage in discussion. There were people who were Christians but find themselves on the skeptical end of Christians, and there were non-Christians, maybe skeptics who've been brought along by Christian friends.
That's true.
And were glad of somewhere to come and talk. So there was a lot of conversation going on.
Yeah, and we had so many And we didn't feel we were kind of great speakers, all these amazing speakers at Greenbelt. So we didn't really feel we had anything to contribute as speakers. So we just got them in small groups as quickly as we could, and off it went. And it was tremendous, really, because
It gave us the speakers to speak, not like another person to speak, but I mean, the microphone and speakers, because of course they wanted it again, and this time because of so many, I think more came than they thought, and that's why I think they set it up for us the second time. Because it really went quite well with a lot of the same people and a lot of new people the second time. So, Okay, so this is the summer of slavery. Seems like it's been a long time, but really grateful to have Steve here to add as we move down through church history and right up through to the abolitionist movement. But we just need to recap where we've got to so far. So who's going to help me out here? Francis?
Yep. Oh, gosh. Right. Well, we were looking at the 10 myths that I identified about slavery, most of them from the Old Testament. And they were I suppose what I would crystallize about the Old Testament, rather than going through them one by one, would be to say that the rules about slavery were a lot nicer if you were an Israelite than if you were a foreigner. So slavery was not wonderful, but it wasn't too bad if you were an Israelite and you had certain protections mandated by the Old Testament law. If you were a foreigner, not so much. Then life was a lot tougher, and slavery was for life. It wasn't just for 6 years, and you weren't. You didn't have protections against being kidnapped to be made into a slave.
It was more similar to it was chattel slavery.
It was, yes, it was absolutely
for the foreigners.
For the foreigners, it was chattel slavery.
Yeah, there's a certain reluctance, isn't there? If you're released by God from slavery in Egypt, and then you set up your own nation, there's a certain reluctance to hold each other as slaves, you would imagine.
Yes, because slavery, contrary to what is sometimes argued, slavery was not a nice position to be in. It was not a great estate to have, being a slave.
Yeah. But it's sort of fair game to have a foreigner as a slave.
Yes, you should take your slaves from the nations around you.
Yeah,
and women, even in the Israelite, when you did have Israelite have own Hebrew slaves, there was changing. The women, for example, the wife couldn't leave like the man could. And
the women, even amongst the Israelites, the women who were sold into slavery were not allowed to go at the end of the 6 years. So,
and then when the New Testament swings round,
well, that was, I think we all sort of roughly saw the same thing. That even though there was a lot of comments, the institution of slavery itself was not actually challenged as an institution. It was just like the behaviour and treatment from master to slave within it was being looked at and addressed, and it's a fair point, but the whole institution was not being challenged. And even Jesus used slavery as an analogy for judgment and stuff like that,
to illustrate one of his parables.
So you'll be beaten with few stripes, more stripes, left, right, in the age to come, presumably.
Yes.
There was some author who said that they were blind to the iniquities of slavery. They just sort of didn't notice it.
Yes, that's right. And so even Paul can use, you're slaves of Christ. You're free in Christ in some sense, and you're slaves of Christ in another. So, Steve, you got any comments on the perspective of?
I do have a couple of thoughts. One is that I'm not sure you're giving full credit to Paul for his attitude in the letter that he wrote to Philemon about the slave Onesimus, because my reading of that is that that this slave of a Christian has been spending time with Paul, working with him while Paul's in prison, and now the time has come for him to go back to his master Philemon. And so Paul sends him back with a message saying to Philemon, here is Onesimus back, and I'm really sad to be losing him from the work that he's doing. So I'm asking you to send him back to me, not as a slave any longer, but as a brother of yours and mine. And Paul says, I could order you to do this, but it's nicer, isn't it, if I just ask nicely? So my reading of that is that there's a huge expectation from Paul that this person isn't going to be a slave any longer. And as that is the only thing that Paul says about slavery, that feels quite telling to me.
Are you, just for anybody that's listening, picking up on the sort of things I've said before, are you meaning Paul as in acknowledging that Ephesians and 1 Timothy and all of that are not Paul?
Yes, that's right. Yes. There is plenty.
Hey, what about? Yeah.
Yes, there's plenty said in the name of Paul.
Exactly.
In the New Testament
about women and slaves.
Yes, that's right. But even that, and I take that as being a next generation of Christianity, which is a little bit more accommodating and conservative, I suppose, in their attitude to imperial society. But even then, I do wonder what you want the New Testament to say, or what you think that it might have said that it didn't say, because, this is Christians in Rome seem to be a kind of in the underclass of society, and they're on the fringes of society, and they're this small, very controversial group of low caste people. And slavery was so integrated into the whole economy and society and structure of the empire. I think it was 10% of the empire was slaves, and in Italy itself, maybe a third of people were slaves. And every walk of life, every job that there was to do, that was the work of slaves. So it's such a huge institution that really isn't within the power of Christians to do anything about. And what was there really to be gained? If Paul had said, and I think slavery is a terrible thing and the empire should abolish it, would Nero have read Paul's letter to the Ephesians and said, oh, that's a good point, these scum that I'm burning to light my garden parties have a good point, I'm going to abandon slavery? I just don't really see that was something that they saw it's worth engaging with. It was just life.
That's any response, Francis?
Well, Paul could have said, don't own slaves, even though we can't. I mean, there were a lot of things they couldn't change. There were a lot of things they didn't like or agree with about the way the Romans carried on. But that was no reason why because Romans did it, that Christians had to do it.
Yeah. But I do think that, I totally see your point, but I think that there was such a spectrum of slavery from, really awful, horrible stuff on the slave ships and in the mines, the galleys, we right through to basically Downton Abbey kind of servitude. And, we talk about it all under the one word of slavery. And would it have been realistic for Christians to say all slavery is wrong? Because that's talking about, a much more benign form of servitude as well as much more malign forms of slavery. And, would it be like looking at our world now and saying, well, we're surrounded by various kinds of servitude. The person who brings the takeaway on the motorbike and the child labour that goes into the phone that I buy and the T-shirt that I buy. And, it's one thing to not like the fact that that's going on, but to realistically talk about getting rid of it. I don't like the fact that my T-shirts are made by children, but what do I do about that?
What do you do about that?
It's the long haul. We talked about this before. It depends if you have a view of the long haul, because I think Paul, I tend to have a view that Paul didn't think we're going to last long anyway, and that even the Galatians verse of there's no male or female or slave nor free is not meant to be disband everything in the practice now. It's like the time is short, but the new age and the resurrection and all the rest of it disbands with all of that at that point. And I don't think that in Paul's mind, he may have said, it's just outside the box to think of the whole institution was the fabric of society, and it's really how you behave within that fabric until this very short-term second coming, which didn't occur. I think he probably would have been shocked at the way history went on, and so that's probably one reason why Paul didn't mention it. And then the followers that wrote in his name were getting much more conservative about women and about slaves, and started to sort of keep them in order and keep them keep the structures going. Oh, Ed, are you there?
Yes, I am here. I haven't said a whole lot. Going right back to Philemon and Onesimus, I thought there's quite a debate, and it's a minority view that Paul is asking
him to
Philemon to take to free Onesimus. It's just to take him back because he has run away, and he's needs to be forgiven and accepted.
But he does ask him to take him
brother.
back no longer as a slave, but as a brother.
But isn't that because he's become a Christian? How would he have suggested he treated him if Onesimus hadn't become a Christian? Yeah. It does rather suggest that he got special treatment. It's a little bit, actually, I think, like your fellow Israelites. Yes. Your fellow Christian, be good to them. But it doesn't say, there's nothing to say generally, be a good master to slaves.
Yes, but
all these other verses that maybe we're saying aren't from Paul but are from a later age, they had no problem having both them as a brother and as a slave.
Yeah, masters treat your slaves well, slaves obey.
That's right. Absolutely, yes.
But also the other thing, though, Steve, on that would be the actual that a lot of people have made a lot on this. That a throwaway little comment about a personal interaction with that slave and Paul becomes the lynch, almost like the slave blow that people were wanting. But it would have been better to have had, like, I'm saying this, of course, because in an ideal world we shouldn't really have slaves. We should all treat each other as brothers.
I certainly wouldn't want to claim too much for the letter of Philemon that it's an abolitionist tract or anything like that. We're kind of reading between the lines. It's just that is the only thing we have to go on Paul's attitude to slavery, and it doesn't seem to me to be a simple embracing of the institution, but where he had the one chance to do something about one slave, to basically command the master to free them. That's my reading of it.
Or to at least treat as a brother, because the debate still is on whether, in fact, it's.
I'm not trying to silence all debate, but I'm saying my reading of it is no longer a slave, brother.
And I think
and a big thing that is in the New Testament that we talked about in the last episode, and that is the emphasis on the equality of everybody, neither slave nor free, male nor female, Gentile, or the whole thing, and that is what initiated eventually the abolition of slavery in the British Empire 1700 years later.
Yes.
So we could, that is there, and that is presumably what is driving Paul in this one instance to be, for Onesimus and Philemon to reconcile each other.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a principle that has survived as a thread throughout all church history. But of course, along with much else as well, it's complicated, and there's other things pulling in more conservative direction. But that
if you're
something that does keep coming up.
If you're a conservative, you tend to think Ephesians, Colossians, pastorals are all Paul anyway, and then you start to think, all right, how do we make that Paul sound the same as the Galatians Paul and even the Philemon Paul? And if it does seem to be a striking contrast actually between reading Ephesians, particularly on the slave structure there. It just doesn't quite have that ring that Paul seems to have in Galatians and Philemon.
Yeah, and just one more thing on those the instructions as well, because there are 3 instructions to slaves, aren't there, in 3 different letters supposedly by Paul, all telling them to be obedient and to be good slaves, and then one to masters telling them to be good masters. And so it sounds very much from that like there was more expectation that there would be slaves in the church than there would be slave masters. There's only one word to slave masters.
Ed picked up on this last time, didn't you, Ed?
Yeah. And so, it does sound like you're talking to slaves. They're in slavery. What can they do about it? Nothing really. So this is how to make the best of the situation.
Yeah. I think it is an interesting. It gets complicated because of the different authors of the actual letters, but it's still. I mean, Steve Chalk was the famous one with the quote, isn't it? The New Testament doesn't give the death blow we're all waiting for, unless it is for Philemon. And it's like, but even then you have to get into the unpacked. Did Paul think it was all going to end soon anyway? So just have good attitudes towards each other within this structure. That we're not political, basically. We're New Age people waiting for the kingdom.
Yeah, we're living within the empire.
We need to keep moving.
Yeah.
So our first thing is just generally the impact on the history since the early church. And actually, we haven't done Francis' last myth, number 10. So you're raring to go on this one, Francis?
Well, that was that Christianity was it's something we've actually...
We have covered
touched on it,
yeah.
In effect. But the last myth is that Christianity was the source of the idea that all people shared a common humanity, and this was what ultimately led to the abolition of slavery, which I don't accept because prior to Christianity there had already been an idea. I think it was the Stoics who said that people were all equal. There was a sense of people being having equality, and one of the best-known Greek opponents of slavery was Alcidamas. I'm not sure if I've pronounced his name correctly. In the 4th century BC, who said, "God has set everyone free. No one is made a slave by nature." And Seneca, in one of his letters, says that of people who talk about slaves dismissively, he says, "They are men. They're not slaves. They're comrades. They're unpretentious friends. They are our fellow slaves. If one reflects that fortune has equal rights over slaves and free men alike. Kindly remember that he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself, breathes, lives, and dies." So there was, previous to Christianity, there was already this view amongst some people that there wasn't this demarcation between one sort of human who was a master and a completely different sort of human who was meant to be a slave.
Well, I'll tell you what, though, Francis, to add to that, to add injury to insult, there is actually 17th century, I believe, it sort of arose, this idea that, in fact, that Africans did not come from Adam and Eve. There was a view that were trying to justify, I suppose, the slavery that was going on by saying, so they can't be descendants of Adam. The sort of more beasts and things like that kind of terrible stuff, terrible stuff. But by Christian people that had muted that idea to either justify what they saw, but said, well, if they are of Adam, then how can we treat them like beasts? It's like, well, maybe they are then, and they're not from Adam. People were forced to think a bit like that, and it's a terrible view. Even before Darwin, it's quite a shock. I don't know, Steve, we've heard that before, or Ed?
Yes, yeah.
Christian people.
David Hume, one of the great figures of the British Enlightenment, argued that white people were a different species to various other humans.
Yeah. So that's not a nice thing within. It's almost like we'll also mention the curse of Ham in the Bible.
David Hume was very much not a Christian.
Yes, no.
Yeah, David Hume's a kind of bit of a hero of mine. So
yes, that's right. Yes, you do get views from all over the place. But there were Christian people who believed in Adam, but then the black race, as it were, didn't come from that. Or even worse still, or whatever, or equal, is the curse of Ham. That was used.
That's right. That was very widely used.
The curse of Ham was, in fact, to be made black, and therefore it was the curse to be the slave race. And all of these things were used. Terrible, terrible stuff, using the Bible story, which is such a difficult passage to understand in any sense, let alone that one, to even make it say that. But
it's just what happens all the time, isn't it?
It's justification,
When the Nazis needed to doing the Jews, they did everything they could to sort of say, oh, they're not actually humans properly either. That's how you dehumanize.
They probably
were an inferior race. Yes.
Yeah, the Canaanites were probably seen in that view. The only good one was a dead one, as someone said, from an Israelite point of view. And so, but it's like, but it is interesting that the atheist at the time would have been. I mean, I tell you what, though, Steve, there's a quote that I've got here that actually ties into something along those lines, but the opposite way around. If I can just get my notes up, it was a quote from a guy that was actually a friend of Charles Hodge. Have you ever heard of Charles Hodge?
Yes.
And he was a debater with Charles Hodge on just church structure. It wasn't about this, and he was a pro-slavery Christian. And he said, here we are. He goes, the parties in the conflict, this is of the abolitionists and the slaveholders, he says, are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, socialists, communists, red Republicans on one side, and friends of the order of regulated freedom on the other, i.e. his side. And so he was actually saying that this is much stronger. We've got atheists here who are abolitionists, and that's socialists are abolitionists.
In the American South, yes, that was a frequent charge made against abolitionists, that abolitionism is undoubtedly atheistical in nature. I believe, I can't remember who said that, but that was quite a famous sermon delivered by one of the southern pastors, and that was very commonly found. We are fighting we're not just fighting against abolitionists. By fighting against abolitionists, we are fighting against atheism. I mean, yes, there's an awful lot of that.
Completely take Francis's point that Christians were not the only ones who introduced the idea of equality in the ancient world, but it was very much not the predominant idea in the Roman world. It was a very unusual idea, and much more popular was Aristotle's idea that nature is inherently hierarchical, and some people are by nature born slaves and some people are by nature born rulers. And so Christians, the Stoics. Christians were not the only ones who believed that all people are made in the image of God, although they may be the only ones who used that phrase. But they were people who believed that all people were made in the image of God. And it was that Christian idea that was picked up in later years, including by the abolitionists in the British Empire. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So that the actual thread that came down was via the church. It wasn't from the Stoics.
Yes.
Yeah,
and that guy that I mentioned that debated Charles Hodge on whatever, he actually used that Aristotle's argument that in fact some people were kind of almost born for slavery and some for noble, and in God's creation. So it's kind of like, it's almost like you can almost get the opposite somewhere,
Well, I think that's what I'd say, that you ideas. I don't see Christianity as just those ideas coming from nowhere else and just blossoming straight out of Christianity. I think there were two competing ideas in the ancient world, and though that carried on down the years, and then the idea that everyone shared a common humanity gradually took precedence. And from my point of view, as ever, there was, of course, stuff in the Bible that you could find to support that argument. But there was also stuff that went the other way. So both
We're
sides...
going on to the slave Bible about that later.
Well, that's right. Both sides could go back to the Bible and point to stuff and say, look, the Bible says I'm right.
Yes.
Yeah.
The
Okay,
moral
so
high
let's
ground
tell
on
this
fire.
story, please.
What story?
Well, the story from we're still kind of flitting about, but we sort of vaguely in the ancient world and the
Right. Okay.
New Testament times.
Yeah.
So let's at least move on to the Church Fathers, and then we'll move on to kind of how eventually slavery was driven out of the Roman Empire. But let's do the Church Fathers first.
Okay. Well, do you want me to just have a quick run through
Indeed.
that?
Yeah.
I mean, I found an article. I don't know. Perhaps you can put it up on the show notes.
Yep.
Ed.
I'll do that.
About the early church fathers and their views on the punishments of slaves, and in fact, generally about slavery. And it is quite surprising how I found it quite surprising how definite they were about the not just the acceptability but the desirability of their Christian followers who had slaves punishing their slaves. They considered that slaves did need to be punished, and that you were not doing a virtuous thing by shirking your duty and in not punishing them. And some of the writings that are quoted from here in this article, it's by somebody called C.L. De Wet from the University of South Africa. Some of he quotes from John Chrysostom. I'm never sure if I get these names right in my pronunciation. He quotes from Tertullian. He quotes from Basil. He quotes, who was one of the bishops. He quotes from Augustine.
Yep.
And he says that the distinction that was made with Aristotle's view was that they didn't think slavery was natural, but they, in the sense that it was rooted in humanity from the very beginning, but they did think that it was an inevitable outcome of sin. They did think that in a sinless world there would have been no slaves, but we're in a sinful world, and slavery was one of the punishments for being in this sinful world.
So what are we talking about, Steve, with all these names Francis gave? What years are we talking about?
So we're talking about from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries.
Yeah. And is that fitting with your view?
It really is. I completely take what Francis is saying. The leaders of the church were integrated into the Roman Empire by this point, and as they were kind of inheriting a world where slavery seemed integral to it, and they defended the institution, and absolutely agree with Francis that they told masters to discipline their slaves to make them behave properly. The only thing that I would put in balance to that is that was not absolutely unanimous from the church fathers. You had Gregory of Nyssa making a very, very strong argument against slavery on the basis that all people are made in the image of God, and therefore it was a blasphemy to enslave your fellow people, and God made all people equal, and so we should be treating them as equal. But he was a voice crying out in the wilderness, I guess.
Well, but eventually in the Byzantine, which is what sort of got left over from the Roman Empire, slavery did get sorted, didn't it?
Yeah, there was a taboo against enslaving fellow Christians. So people...
Back to that again.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So Christians who had the money would prefer to buy... or to get hold of pagan slaves. And after the fall of Rome, that became very easy because Europe was overtaken by the Goths and the Franks, etc., etc. But they one by one converted to Christianity and settled down and became Europe. And so, Christian Europe kind of ran out of pagan slaves, and slavery really did diminish hugely. There was still some around, particularly around the fringes where there was contact with the Islamic world. I believe that almost every European language has the same word for slave, or basically the same word for slave, which comes from the name of the tribe Slav, which because they were one of the last pagan tribes left in Europe, and so every language took their word for slave from the fact that they were the last source of slaves left.
So when do you think slavery finally wasn't a thing in, say, the Byzantine Empire?
I couldn't answer that with authority, sorry.
Okay.
I don't know so much about the East.
Right. Yeah. But, okay. But Charlemagne and all that sort of, by that time, slavery was very, very unusual.
You see, Charlemagne was living in this earlier period that I was talking about, where the Roman Empire had just kind of started to diminish its use of slaves. But now Charlemagne was in the time when he was fighting against the pagan tribes and conquering them and converting them to Christianity. So slavery was actually very much part of his strategy.
Right.
In that it was only when they were Christians that when these tribes had converted that slavery really died out.
But when Christianity came back to when Christianity came back to Britain, and with kind of Bede, it was a couple of 100 years after that, I guess. I remember reading him, and I can't remember any note of slavery still being a thing in Britain in that time.
What sort of year?
I mean, I thought that there was a type of slavery which was serfdom. I thought that there were slaves, but they weren't serfs a type of slave. Have I got that wrong?
Well, they weren't free, but I suppose this is another complication when we're talking about slavery, whether in the ancient world or the Middle Ages, is that to us it's really quite cut and dried who's slave and who's free. Because if you're not a slave, we have all kinds of freedoms that we enjoy in our society, where in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, you could not be a slave, but that didn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that you could choose where you lived or what you did for a living or who you were to marry or what you to wear or what you were to eat, because society wasn't like that. The structure of society was that people had their place and didn't have those powers and freedoms unless they were very rich. So without using the term slavery, there was a lot of unfreedom around.
Yeah, it looks like we covered the spectrum in the Old Testament, the spectrum through the different, right the way to hired servants to the chattel foreigners. And so it's the same sort of thing everywhere. You have to sort of scan what is the current state of things, so it is, from our point of view, it's difficult. I suppose it's easy to put our moral judgments back into the past as if it should have been like it is now, clearly to everybody. But it wasn't, was it? It was normal to them to a degree.
Yeah.
A lot of this, or at least assumed to be the way life is.
Okay, so let's move on now to sort of more modern slavery. And the story starts, I guess, with how Christian Europe got into trading slaves and putting them in ships and everything. So let's quickly turn to Steve, our history expert.
Yes, so slavery really had, by, let's say, the 15th century, become unknown to most of Western Europe, the Christian society there. The problem was that Spain and Portugal were planting colonies in the Americas, and the indigenous population was almost completely dying out. So although they did make them work on their plantations, they soon found that they needed an awful lot of labor to produce the goods that they wanted to import from the Americas, and more that they could find locally, and so started going to Africa, where there was already a kind of indigenous slave trade, partly to provide slaves to the Islamic world. And so they started buying into that, and and once they'd bought into it, they also started going and taking their own slaves there. And Britain got into the slave trade later, but it basically found that it also needed slave trade if it was going to be able to make a profit from its plantations in North America and in the Caribbean. And so it kind of picked up on what the Spanish and Portuguese had started.
Yeah,
but developed
we were
much further,
we
much,
did it on
much.
steroids.
Yes, yeah,
We
absolutely.
did it on steroids compared to them.
Yeah.
We were 10 times more or something. Slaves were.
That sounds right. Yes.
Ships. Yeah. And are you aware of any of the early discussion of early voices saying, surely this isn't right, or was it somehow accepted by all?
No, it wasn't accepted, really. When the first slave expedition, if I remember this correctly, went out in the time of Queen Elizabeth from England, she heartily disapproved of it and said that God would curse England if it was to indulge in the crime of slavery. But that first ship came back laden with massive profits, and she was convinced. So the kind of expectation of Christians in Western Europe was that slavery was wrong because it wasn't something that was part of their world. But the economy became built on it, and it was the people who took a principled stance in the face of slavery that they already knew about were, first of all, the Quakers. And this was as early as the 17th century. They were the first people to look slavery in the face and to condemn it. But there was a general assumption that slavery was wrong. But once Britain had got into the position where its economy depended upon it, then it became less morally simple about what they were going to do about it.
That's Brad Pitt's character in 12 Years a Slave, representing who was the group we just mentioned? The Quakers.
Is he a Quaker? Yes.
I think so. Is that sort of that?
No, I think you're 200 years out, Andrew.
Yeah, but the stream of thought, you're just saying that's where it started.
Yes, and Quakers continued to take a lead in
it was something that would have been there from that source as the time went on.
Yeah. So we're.
Can I just mention? I think it's worth mentioning that. So I'm talking about the 1680s when Quakers first started condemning slavery in North America. The Quakers started in 1640s, 1650s. I can't put my finger on the exact date, but it's very, very early in Quakerism that they took a stand against slavery. So it does seem to be something that was really deeply rooted in Quakerism, because they had the belief that every person has the divine light in them. That's why they couldn't stand slavery. So it does go right back to the beginning of their movement, I think. And
it continued right through, because I remember in your quiz in the Jesus Arms at Greenbelt,
yes,
the question was the answer was that something like 70 or 80% of the first abolitionists group were
Yes, it was the founding of the first the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. There were 12 founder members, and 7 of them were Quakers.
Yeah, right. That's right. So it goes right through. Do the Anabaptists and descendants from them have the same view? Right to the Mennonites and this kind of movement.
Yes, I'm not really sure about the continental Mennonite tradition. I know that within Britain, the Baptists would be the closest thing. Didn't really get involved. None of the nonconformist churches got that involved until the beginning of the 19th century. It was really the Quakers and then Anglican evangelicals who were leading the movement. The nonconformists were a little bit slower to.
So that's well over 100 years of a kind of lone voice in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And how about the Enlightenment? Because people like me want to sort of egg up that, but I have no idea if we should.
That's completely fair. There were some mixed messages from Enlightenment thinkers. John Locke was generally against slavery, but he thought it was acceptable for prisoners of war to be enslaved. We mentioned David Hume already, but I think the general drift of Enlightenment thought was thoroughly against slavery, that it was barbaric and unjust.
Which is what taps in then to the later Christian thought, who was seeing it as the sort of non-Christian kind of attack on the slavery. As abolitionists, was to them it was like all of these different groups are all ganging up on this Christian, well, what they saw as a Christian view. That's interesting, these different voices. Thomas Paine a bit later, is that right?
Yes. He was an abolitionist.
Yeah, that's right.
But apparently some of the founding fathers who were steeped in the Enlightenment, for the Americans, that is, the founding fathers of America were slave owners.
Were slave owners themselves, yeah.
Yes. And yes, because, again, there's, you see the pattern where the Enlightenment way of thinking predisposes people to assume that slavery is a bad thing. But if they then find that actually a lot of their income is depending on a plantation, then it gets a little more complicated.
That's like global warming in the oil companies.
Yeah.
And what you were saying about T-shirts and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's something that's across the board, isn't it? That when you find you have to give something up to be true to your ideals, then it becomes more complicated.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it's probably a good thing, Ed, just a minute. Steve and I were talking at Greenbelt about this guy that I had independently sort of found out about, and then Steve knew who I was talking about. Could you just say that little snippet, anecdotal story about that guy that is now a hero but was crazy at the time with the Bible and the blood?
Oh, yeah. So there was, the North American Quaker. I can't even remember his name. You'll have to help me out.
Yes, I've forgotten it myself. But the story, I had forgotten it myself. But anyway, yeah.
He was a short fellow, and he dressed in quite flamboyant clothing. I think military outfits and stuff. And he would do very passionate speeches against abolition, and one of his gimmicks was that he would have a Bible that he would stab with a knife, and blood would spurt out because he had hollowed it out and put a bladder full of blood in the middle of it.
And he was seen as like he was making a point, but just seen as like what you'd see today as some sort of crazy guy coming in, and you just sort of politely. Yeah,
and he's been kind of, in retrospect, the Quakers obviously don't make saints. It's very much not their thing. But the equivalent, he's been kind of canonized in the annals of Quakerism as being one of the heroes. But at the time, he was a very controversial figure within Quakerism.
Yeah,
interesting.
Now, when I was a Christian, and we were thought Wilberforce was amazing, and he was one of us, and it was our lot. The kind of evangelically end of Christianity that led the way in the abolitionist movement in Britain. Now, there is a lot of heroism and a lot to be admired in all that, but did we over-egg it, do you think?
Well, I think that if Wilberforce is held up to be the abolitionist, then it's unfair on a lot of people. Like we've already covered, the Quakers were the people who started it off. Wilberforce kind of picked up the baton and ran with it. The difference was that Quakers were kind of on the fringes of society. These people had wealth, but they had no political influence, whereas Wilberforce was an MP. He was a close friend of the Prime Minister, so he was able to take those principles and put them into power. So I think that he was essential to the abolition of the slave trade, but he wasn't the only one, and he didn't start it.
And how many, I suppose almost everybody were Christians, so it's hard to say if it was a Christian movement or a people movement.
I think that's one of the problems when sometimes people say, well, what did the atheists do about putting an end to slavery? So few people would admit to being an atheist back in the day. I mean, there weren't, partly there weren't many of them anyway, but what few there were not going to stand up and say, I'm an atheist. So it's very difficult to know one way or the other what they...
I think it's very fair to say that there were leading abolitionists who were not personally motivated by religion. Tom Paine would be a good one. Charles James Fox was a leading member of Parliament who was not a devout person at all. Is
he the kind of fat one?
Yes, yeah. But for Wilberforce and his circle, their faith was absolutely a strong motivation, and it's not something that you can disentangle from humanism, from humanitarianism. Rather, they were motivated by innate morality. But for Wilberforce particularly, the idea that he was going to have to stand on the day of judgment before God and give an answer to the question, what have you done with all the wealth and power that I gave you? That really did turn his life around, that question, and make him devote decades and decades of indefatigable labour to this cause that looked many times like it was hopeless. So it gave him the motivation to start it, and also it gave him the motivation to carry on, because even if he failed, his ultimate question was not, have I achieved to do this good thing in the world? Have I succeeded in doing this good thing in the world? His question was, what will God say to me when I stand before him? And, if God had not given him success, then that was God's problem. But if Wilberforce had not done his job, then that would be Wilberforce's problem. That is very much the way he thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say my question on Wilberforce would be, would he be seen... like the progressive, if you say a liberal Christian today, say, the Bible's sort of diverse, it's split, different views, it's a problematic text here, but this is what I think the essence is. Was he like that, or did you ever feel that he was spinning all those other texts to try and make it fit a coherency?
He was absolutely certain, passionately clear. It was utterly obvious to him that the Bible was simply anti-slavery. There was just no question in his mind about that. Now, from our point of view, that's I think quite hard to get our heads around, because from the conversation that you've been having over recent months about slavery in the Bible, how could Wilberforce not see that? But I guess it was something to do with the fact that that Western British society were understood that the heart of Christianity, the key message of Christianity, what it was really all about was that stuff about do unto others as you would have them do unto you, love your neighbor, and put other people before yourself. And people differed into how seriously they took that and whether they thought you could combine that with a successful career. But that was Christianity, and you had to decide how seriously you were going to take Christianity. So that was just so ingrained, that assumption, that I guess when people saw stuff about slavery in the Bible, their brains just kind of skirted around it. You could understand it spiritually, maybe. You could see it as giving us a spiritual lesson, or you could just...
it's an interesting...
I don't know.
That's really amazing. Yeah, for me, Steve...
Yeah.
When I was evangelical, I would say your kind of assessment of Christianity there was a sort of school assembly version of Christianity, and we thought that was dreadful. It was all about the gospel and being at one with Christ and that kind of thing, not just the teaching of Jesus on.
So I guess when Wilberforce had his conversion and became an evangelical Christian, he added to that basis the idea that it has to change your entire life, and you have to be totally committed, and you have to be born again, and you have to have this relationship with God. but still that assumption that the message of Jesus to us is act in this way, that really did seem to be fundamental to people's understanding of the Christian life. And what
where I was sort of sliding towards in where I was going was, if you then become a more kind of evangelical Christian and look carefully at the Bible rather than just a kind of human instinct of being kind to people, then you start maybe becoming more like the American Bible Belt slaveholders and their pastors and everybody who were picking out all these bits in the Bible to prove that slavery is instituted by God.
Some of them would just say, what? What does the Lord saith? And they quote this verse, and you get this sort of, it wasn't just the southern churches, it was people from different denominations, even in the north, in that were actually making arguments, and they were saying, what does this, these people saying, because the Bible says, there's no better grounding. And it's so fascinating. I'd love to get one of them people sitting with Wilberforce and just watch them, because I would just think, wow.
Yes. I think that Wilberforce would have been appalled and disgusted.
Yes, probably would.
And it was just so obvious to him that the heart of Christianity is loving people, loving God, that it just can't mean that. Even if it seems like it does, there must be another way of understanding it. And also that assumption was shared by Wilberforce's opponents as well. The anti-abolitionists in Britain never questioned for a moment the idea that the Bible is against slavery. They just took the argument away from Christianity, away from the Bible, and said this is an economic argument. However bad you think slavery is, we have to do it for economic reasons. We have to put our Christianity to one side. Or they would say, if slavery isn't as bad as you think it is, these people are actually having a nice time out there. It's much better than being in Africa, so slavery's fine. What they never, ever, ever did in Britain in the abolition campaign is to say the Bible is on behalf of slavery, because I think Wilberforce just treated that with utter contempt and derision.
Right.
Really,
that is
interesting.
a world apart from another world, isn't it? Yeah. Because if you saturate
I think they missed a trick there, because because if you want it's pro-slavery, there's plenty of material to work on. But,
gosh, yes, I was going to say, I could say to those people, hey, don't put Christianity aside, just go to the States. And
Francis found this wonderful essay, The Southern Defense of Slavery, and we'll definitely put a link to it.
It's just shocking, isn't it? It's absolutely shocking. Sometimes you think, now from this point of view, anyway, from today's thing, it is shocking to read, but it's there. It's just there,
Yeah. I think we have mentioned it, discussed it.
We did. We talked about it. The first, I think it was.
We haven't mentioned something though that's a bit more positive, or at least can be seen as a much more positive thing, and that's ironically the Slave Bible. Which we've mentioned.
Yes, we must mention that.
We must mention that. So do you want me to say a little bit about that?
There was a lovely clip. I forget how I saw it. From there's this Bible museum.
That's right.
Which the evangelicals have started, and I think it's obviously big in America.
Yeah,
and
that's one of 3 Bibles.
One of their exhibits is this wonderful slavery Bible, where all the bits that were encouraging African slaves to kind of be inspired by this freedom from slavery in Egypt and all that sort of thing, they were all cut out of the Bible to make sure they didn't get ideas in their heads.
That's right. And I having to research this a bit more, it's very, very fascinating. I think that the roots of it is a little bit more understandable than actually just someone who's like being a Marcionite, but for another reason, it seems to have been kicked off by the slave revolt in Haiti, which was a successful one apparently, where it's a little uprising and kicking out the people who colonized them or whatever. And after that, it was like, well, we can't have that again. And here's the surprising thing: they made this Bible, but they were being upfront. They weren't trying to con people that this was the Bible, because you know what the title was. The title the actual title, can you believe it, is Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for the Use of Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. That's on the book. I've seen it in the photo. It's on the book. Yeah. So what it was for, not that they're expecting people to read because they couldn't read or whatever, it was to stop.
Oh, I see.
It was to stop missionaries inadvertently covering Galatians and these other stories, or just reading a passage that happens to say, remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. And what they did is they actually cut out, obviously, the Exodus, but, they left in Joseph being put into slavery. They left in that. And
they had a happy ending.
That's right. So anything that would lead you into slavery and to make you think that that's where you are is a good thing. And so they left Ephesians 6:5 in the New Testament. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the singleness of your heart unto Christ. That was all kept. Galatians obviously was dropped out. And so what it was, though, it was literally to stop the preachers accidentally. So the preachers were to read this. This is part selected for use, i.e., please, we don't want you to say something that might incite another rebellion, because they'll go, oh, right, So it wasn't so sinister as one may think, but no one to date knows who did it, who actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not known. It's like a group of people. It was definitely London. So this is ironic with everything that Steve has said, because of course Britain was like, I wonder if Wilberforce would have actually known these people, So it was specifically for the West Indies. It was for the islands of, if I remember rightly from what I was doing, from the Caribbean islands, 3 particular ones, and it was basically the sugar plantations there, and it was just to stop that sort of thing. But it is fascinating to know that some parts of the Bible could cause. Wilberforce would have liked that point. Yes. Yeah.
I wrote the books that I wrote about Wilberforce and the abolition of the slave trade 10 years ago, and I've been very happy to find that some of that information is still there. So thank you.
You know that other people are writing in your name now, Steve. Generation down the line.
Oh, don't listen to them.
Yeah, don't.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
So our summer of slavery is sort of turned into an Indian summer, or
yeah. We're abolishing it now. There is no part 4. There's not going to be. Yeah, we're abolishing
that.
That's right.
We're all manumitted.
Yes. So, Ed, you can close the show.
Okay. Well, Steve, thank you so much. We've really enjoyed your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was
great insights. Yeah.
Yeah. And the listeners will have something else other than slavery to look forward to next month.
Yes.
And so, meanwhile, I'll sign off. It's goodbye from me, Ed.
And it's goodbye from me, Andrew.
Goodbye from me, Francis.
And goodbye from me, Steve.